Part two of our trauma series. My name is Amy Julian. I'm the director for the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University. And I'm excited today to be with you to discuss chronic stress, trauma, and resilience during the pandemic, which I think is something that all of us are feeling as we move through living with and operating within the realm of COVID. I want to do a little housekeeping items as we get started, and then I'm going to hand the floor over to our presenter. Couple little things there in the bottom on that chat. When you click the chat, be sure that you toggle over that and you're clicking to everyone. You do have the options to panelist only or everyone. Be sure you're clicking that to everyone so we can all see your responses. And then all of you are muted, and we do invite you to remain muted unless you have a question, and then we'll be able to assist you or unmute yourselves. But if you could please remain muted as well. And then with that, just a couple other fun and exciting things. This session is being recorded. You will have it available on our website. We'll send a link out in the next day or so to show you where to find that on our ICSPS website. And then again, this is part two of our series on trauma, so we do invite you to attend our other sessions as well, and Shanna will get to those as we go. I do want to introduce our speaker today and through this series, Shanna Shipman. Shanna is a great asset to our team and has come on to assist us in creating this dialogue space around trauma and really giving all of you an opportunity to really come together and discuss trauma. So with that, Shanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you everyone for being here. We have a good number of participants with us today, and I am just so grateful for those precious hours of professionals doing important work. So thank you. Also, thanks for signing in the chat. I can glance at it as we go, and it's so nice to see the collective experience we have on board, people's roles at their institutions, and also everything we're grateful for today, from sunshine to chocolate donuts. So I'm with Trisha on that last one, but we're enjoying sunshine here too. I'm in Peoria, Illinois, and it's frigid and sunny, and we are doing well. I'll continue to introduce myself really quick. I always say not because I think I'm important, but because when I log onto a webinar, I always like to know who is speaking and from which perspective they come. So my vantage point is education, and I've been in the K-12 system for quite a while, but now more into the post-secondary system. I was most recently with AIR, Center and Great Teachers and Leaders. I love my role right now as an adult educator here in Peoria. And I really began my interest in trauma working with refugees earlier in my career. But that's an experience I keep with me because many of the needs I see in our educational systems are universal. So it all informs the other. Our topic today is trauma during a pandemic, and then more specifically, how that impacts our work, our service of learners, our service to our communities. So last week, we had a first session in the series focused more broadly on just background information related to trauma. We're going to cover some of that today as well, but also just really try to look through this lens of the pandemic context. But before we do, just mentioning more specifically those other sessions in our webinar series, you can catch the video for last week. I think that will be ready on the website. I know probably by early next week, there's some editing to do. And then we'll be posting the rest of these videos, but please do join us in person if you can. That's always better. And then we can add your voice to the mix. Next week, we'll be looking a little bit closer at trauma as it relates to poverty, although certainly that'll be part of our conversation today as well. And then the next week, really getting into this idea of historical trauma among communities over time, over generations, resulting from often systemic oppressions, and doing our best as a community to really discuss that topic and support each other in our understanding. Then we take some time off and check back in with each other in April, because there might be just bite-sized pieces of implementation that folks would like to check in on and compare notes and lessons learned. So that's the sequence of things, and we hope you'll join us for the duration. And for those of you who were with us last week, thank you for that as well. Today's objectives are similar to last week's, but again, we're looking to this lens of the pandemic, increasing our own awareness as it pertains to our work, and we're going to continue to create this community of learners. So I really invite everyone, and everyone always says it, but I really mean it, to please chime in either through text or chat or through your voice today if anything resonates with you or if you have experience to share. This experience becomes much more rich when your practical lessons learned are added to the mix. So just feel free to interrupt me at any time. I will not be offended, and I really encourage you to do that. So we're going to accomplish our objectives through these kind of agenda items, this brief review of the big ideas, I'd say, related to trauma. It will be insufficient, I promise. So if you're new to this topic, please go back and check out last week or some other reading, because we're just going to have to fly through a little bit of background today. Then we'll focus again on this pandemic context and its impact on our learners and our staffs. Really get into kind of values behind trauma-informed practice and look more closely at strategies. That's really a part of the program where I hope your voices will be very prominent in our discussion. And we'll keep that discussion going through the end of our hour. If you have to leave early for any reason, including if anything we discussed today strikes a chord with you that is unhelpful, that is potentially triggering of your own experiences, that's difficult to consume today for any reason, feel free to shift to do whatever you need to do, wherever you need to do it. And again, we are not offended. I just like to put that warning out there that because we're speaking on the topic of trauma, people may share anecdotes, stories, and if they do not resonate with you in a way that's helpful for your own emotional health, please feel free to adjust. We looked at this image last week and I couldn't help it, throw it in there one more time. Again, just framing our conversation with this idea that the reason we talk about trauma is so that we can sharpen and clarify our view of ourselves and our past experiences, of our colleagues, and certainly of our learners, their families, our community members. We put on a lot of lenses as education providers. We try to see our learners through lenses related to their demographics, related to their situations, related to their past experiences. And trauma is one more lens with which to see our students and try our very best to meet their needs. So what is trauma? Again, this is where we start our super quick background review. It'll just take a few minutes, so thanks for sticking through this. We think of trauma in a simplified way in regard to these basic ideas: an event or series of events. We focus on the experience of the individual. The experience is as harmful physically or emotionally, and that evokes emotion, that evokes fear, that overwhelms a person's ability to cope. So we're speaking neurologically here. This has adverse effects on that individual, their functioning in their daily life, their well-being. We know that this can lead to not only mental health issues, physical health issues. So really it's the combination of these factors that helps us to hone in on this idea of trauma. We really focus on this idea that it overwhelms our regular coping system, our regular coping mechanisms in ways that we can't control. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. We talked last time about how trauma is prevalent. In our chat that I reviewed in detail after last week, many of our participants were fascinated to hear the statistic that about 70% of us have experienced a profound adverse experience in our youth that still can impact us as adults. So that's focusing on adverse childhood experiences, but we know that there are adverse experiences into adulthood as well. So the prevalence of trauma is something to recognize, that really we're kind of all on this gray scale. It's not a matter of a trauma impacted person and not trauma impacted person as much as just kind of recognizing the role of trauma in each of our lives. Trauma is neurological. That's a big idea. This is something related to our brain. This is not choice. This is not behavior in the sense that somebody is acting out in a way intentionally. We're talking about neurological impacts of a previous experience. And trauma is highly individual. Somebody can go through the exact same experience and have a different traumatic or non-traumatic response depending on a host of factors. Their background, their perception, their support system, the aftermath of the event, or if it's not a singular acute traumatic event, a chronic situation where trauma compiles over time. So we keep in mind that highly individual nature of trauma, but again, honing back on this idea that we're talking about the brain. We're talking about an instance where the survival brain is heightened, elevated. The thinking brain, these are simplified terms, is inhibited. And we are lacking the ability to write that with the normal biological mechanisms. So when we talk about being in a heightened sense of that survival brain, and I implore you to do some reading on this when you really get into the physiology and the biology of the brain and how trauma impacts it. It's fascinating. But we're just going to simplify right now and talk about these auto responses that we experience. Fight or aggression, flight, avoiding the problem, freezing is another way to avoid the threat or perceived threat. And this idea of fawning or kind of over pleasing in our lives to avoid, again, threat from any kind of conflict or something resembling a traumatic experience in the past. I think we'll move on. It's really a large discussion when we start talking about definitions and differences between some of the things that we tend to talk about, if not synonymously, or at least in close conjunction with each other. We talk about stress a lot, and we talk about chronic stress, and we talk about it in relation to trauma. All trauma is stressful, but not all stressors are traumatic. So these are related ideas that are different. And to illustrate this difference, I could get into lots of quotes from different experts, but you'll see that they all kind of come at it in a slightly different way. But I'm going to be really honest right now and say, for our purposes today, for our purposes in focusing on system level and certainly classroom level practices that make the learning experience better for individuals, and especially individuals who have undergone trauma, I'm going to say that we don't have to spend too much time dissecting these differences because the practices will benefit us all, certainly benefit those dealing with chronic stress, and certainly benefit those, we hope, dealing with trauma and traumatic responses. So I do turn to this quote from one of my favorite authors on this topic. Traumatized people constantly feel unsafe. The past is alive in them. Their bodies are bombarded by visceral warning signs. So again, we go back to this quality of being in a heightened neurological state, the kind that we find ourselves in when we are in danger, harm's way, and that prolonged heightened state and inhibiting our ability to cope and return back to our regular thinking state is inhibitive in daily life. And it shows up in different ways, right? One of the ways we can divide up kind of these indicators that there's a problem are to look at them emotionally, behaviorally, physically, cognitively. And when you look more specifically at some of these indicators, it is not a stretch to consider how this all impacts learning. Cognitively, absolutely, difficulty processing information, preoccupation maybe with the past event, racing thoughts that seem out of our control, but certainly these physical symptoms, I'd call them, behavioral issues and emotional experiences, all that gets in the way of our goals, right? Of learning and teaching and progressing in people's life goals. So that's why we care and why we attend a webinar on a Thursday afternoon. it's important, and I'm going to pause soon, I promise, but it's important to really not just give lip service, but get some really serious attention to this idea of resilience. This word has come to embrace what we talk about when we talk about positive or adaptive responses to significant adversity, because this is alive and well. Again, people respond to the same events in different ways, and they respond over time in their life in different ways and in different circumstances in different ways. And when protective factors are present, such as supportive relationships, feeling a sense over their own locus of control or decision making in their life, these cultural or faith traditions from which we draw strength, and really safe and supportive environments, when protective factors are alive and well, and of course, just kind of an undauntable human spirit, individuals display amazing stories of resilience and persistence, and we can't discount that. So we walk this line of really acknowledging the realities of the challenges of trauma, and at the same time, knowing that we as human beings have this amazing capability to overcome some of those challenges. And really, that's where we come into play in our professional roles, because we have the power to implement practical strategies and really just awarenesses that cause us to interact differently in our day-to-day experiences with our colleagues and our learners. So we would call this a trauma-informed approach. And of course, that's a grayscale as well, right? That happens to varying degrees. And we begin with just being aware and then work toward practices that are trauma-informed and that are sustainable over time. So what does a trauma-informed system look like? What are those characteristics? I would say as a system, folks realize prevalence, the widespread impact of trauma, understand recovery and resilience, recognize signs and symptoms, and respond through integrated policies, integrating trauma into policymaking, decision-making practices and procedures. One of the goals of that is to actively resist re-traumatization, because heartbreakingly, there are things we can unknowingly do in our classrooms and our systems that can be triggering of trauma for those who have experienced it. So by being more aware, we can seek to not only resist re-traumatization, but create an environment where people can thrive and be healthy. Like we said, this is a journey. You know, these webinars are really kind of in this area of trauma awareness building, with the goal of learning more about how that translates into practice over time. And before we kind of dive into this unique context of a worldwide pandemic, I'll just pause there. I'll see if, I'll ask if anybody has any questions. That was really a fast overview of some of the big rocks, the big ideas related to trauma. So we don't want to leave anyone with burning questions who might have them at this time. So go ahead and use that chat box if you like, or just kind of interject with your voice. We'd love to hear you. Are there any questions, thoughts, or comments at this point?
So Shanna, I've got a couple coming in here. One was more of a statement and seeing how accurate it is. So all trauma is stressful, but not all stressors are traumatic. Is that an accurate statement to make?
I think that is accurate, and that's a piece of the larger picture. So it's accurate, but it's not exhaustive, right? So that is one idea to keep in mind. We can dig a little bit deeper on this, you know, using an example, or even looking to myself as an example. There are stressors that impact us at all times. One of the kind of consensus ideas in the literature is that chronic stress breaches into the realm of trauma when our neurological systems are overwhelmed and we can't cope in the ways we normally would. So that's one kind of differentiator between stress and trauma. A lot of times these terms are used interchangeably, and the differences between them aren't always clear-cut in the literature. Different authors have slightly different takes. But as I said, hopefully the practices we discussed today can help in either context. So I hope that helps.
Wonderful, thank you. And we did have one other comment from an individual saying that they love the idea of being a protective factor for students and colleagues, and others being that protective factor for us.
Yeah, that's empowering, isn't it? I see that here. It's the truth, and really research reveals that supportive relationships are probably our best arsenal against the impacts of traumatic experiences. So yes, we can be protective factors for each other. They are protective factors for us. Our own kind of internal qualities and actions are protective for ourselves. Really important to look at things through that lens of what helps. And yes, I assume the reason everyone's here is because we are interested in serving that role for others. So thanks for that.
Yeah, absolutely, it takes a village. And then one other question was just regarding the PowerPoint and if that will be shared out afterwards. So yes, any resources, the PowerPoint slides, the recording will all be shared on the ICSPS website later this week or next.
Great.
And then we did have another question come through here. Can the research papers around how these relationships support trauma be shared?
Sure. So why don't I take some time this week to kind of pick out some resources, and then we can add them right to the website, Brittany, with the recording for this webinar?
Yeah, that would be perfect.
Awesome. Okay, I'm taking note of that, Aubrey. And Brittany, I can see the chat this week, so we can work together to make sure no comments go unaddressed.
Wonderful, yeah.
Okay. So let's dive into what's on all of our minds and has been for close to a year now. This experience we're all sharing collectively, and I kind of pause on this idea of collective impacts of what we're experiencing. You'll hear the term collective trauma, that entire groups, societies can suffer the effects of a traumatic experience, and we're living through one right now. So that's not to be discounted. We can look to the research, both on the present situation and really in the past, to get an idea about how a pandemic may affect the mental health of our population. So when we do, we see that when during a pandemic, research has indicated increases in stress, as we were discussing, traumatic stress or stress that results from a traumatic experience, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is even different from that. And again, I'm appreciating the questions from the chat and can share some literature about the differences between all these things. Depression, hopelessness, anxiety, panic, grief, all of these interrelated concepts that manifest in different ways in different people, but we know that what we're living through exacerbates them all. So we don't have to spend a huge part of our hour stating things that have become fairly obvious, but in many ways it's still valuable to pause and to acknowledge that we're all experiencing stress at various levels related to our physical safety, that there's a virus that can cause us harm, economic security as our economy tries to adjust in ways to keep the masses safe. That leads to either loss of work or new work demands, taking on more load or different load or a virtual or electronic approach to work that is new and stressful. Social unease and isolation. So, we talk about how difficult it is to not see each other as much or in person, but also when we do see each other, there's a level of social unease. How do I greet a person? How far away do I stand from a person? All of this is this constant awareness that can really wear on us. Domestic relationship strain, our own relationships, our home life, societal, political, racial motivated tensions. This is really something that I look forward to discussing in more depth a couple weeks down the road. So I hope you'll join us. We all know there's a lot going on that requires our responsiveness and sensitivity as educators. Global news impacts that all impacts us, if not directly, then vicariously. So we pause to acknowledge this. Some of us are experiencing more direct forms of trauma related to debilitating illness of individuals or people they love, losing someone that they love, increased or heightened abusive situations as we're home more and have less of an outlet to get away. Poverty, that's a broad umbrella for, or kind of a related factor to a lot of things, but I list it there because that creates a real chronic stress over time that can be traumatic. There are other things to keep in mind as well. So we have kind of various things going on, the stressors we're all feeling, and then the reality that the situation just lends to a heightened risk of traumatic events. I think it's always helpful to think about individuals, and anecdotes come to mind, and I'm certain that there are stories or individuals coming to your mind in your roles right now as we talk about these things. I was just speaking to a fellow educator the other day who's very concerned of a student of hers. This is a male student in his early 20s. He lives with his parents. This educator happens to know, because he shared in confidentiality, that the father of the student is struggling with alcohol abuse, struggling with anger. He's abusive. He's violent in the home. And this young man's usual outlets for being away from home and avoiding all of that came to a screeching halt with some of our shutdowns related to the pandemic, to the point where really he was searching for ways to kind of restrike that really precarious balance he was trying to walk as an individual with an abusive family member. So again, we say this all the time, but we never know. We never know what's impacting our students, our colleagues. But part of being trauma aware is not assuming issues in the context of other people, but assuming the possibility that people are dealing with really difficult things that not only impact them kind of emotionally, but can impact them physically, and absolutely impacts them neurologically in ways that play out in ways that may be hard to understand in our classrooms, our hallways, our systems, our offices. So again, just keeping this trauma aware lens on can have a big difference in how we interact with others. I'll pause here again just for another check with our participants. If anybody wants to chime in, add a thought, a consideration, a question, and I'll go over and I'll be peeking at the chat box as well to see if anybody has anything to add at this time. Okay. I'm going to keep my eye half that direction, so feel free at any time. So an email went out following up from last week, so some of you might have received it. And attached to that email was an extremely simplified kind of reflection tool, I'll call it. It's based on these principles, we'll call them, related to trauma-informed practices. And that tool posed some questions related to each of these 5 kind of big ideas. And I'm going to say not only are these big ideas principles, but I would actually call them needs. I think they are human needs. And often in my experience, and more importantly, the experience of wiser people that have shared, you know, as humans in any situation, whether we're teachers and learners or coworkers or family members, our needs are largely universal, not always the same, but very rarely incompatible. That the things people need usually are not in conflict with each other. When we get into the strategies to meet our needs, it gets a little trickier, right? And so in conflict resolution work, we often focus in on the needs and how can we have strategies that meet everyone's needs or raise the level of experience for everyone. So I'm going to claim that these 5 big ideas related to trauma awareness and trauma-informed principles are actually needs. So one way to approach this work is to keep these needs foremost in our minds and then just ask ourselves kind of practically throughout our work, what am I doing or what I could do to meet these needs? And if we come at it in kind of that basic way, I think sometimes it can feel less overwhelming or intimidating than if we try to consume just lists and lists of strategies, although we have that too. That's coming too. So we focus on this, and especially because that tool went out to many of you in advance, definitely chime in, chat backs or with your voice as we go, but focusing on these ideas, including safety, both physical and emotional. What do we do to make the environment safe, accessible, and welcoming? That's a big topic. So I'd love to hear your ideas about what you're doing in your systems to meet this idea of safety. Trustworthiness. This is huge for someone who's dealing with the after effects of trauma. Our goals, our related procedures communicated clearly. I always like to say, is everybody included in the why? Do our learners have just as much of an understanding of why we're doing the things we're doing as the people implementing the practices as professionals? Is everybody in on the why? Are the goals communicated? The procedures clear? Are things consistent? What do we do to make sure that our learners aren't always surprised of what's going on? Because that consistency, that predictability is huge if someone has undergone trauma. Choice and control as well, kind of regaining that locus of control or autonomy. Whenever possible, do our students have choices? Do they have control over how they learn? Part of this has to do with focusing on our learning objectives as the primary goal, as opposed to, again, the strategies with which we get there. Is there some flexibility that our students can display their mastery over the knowledge they need to move on? Are consequences logical when different choices are made than what's suggested? Collaboration that's meaningful. Are students invited to chime in decision-making on a more systemic level, or at least on the classroom level? I talked to an administrator the other day that had a really amazing story to tell about including her learners in devising the expectations for the class, or maybe you would call them the rules for how they interact with each other. And she had to let some control go on that, which isn't easy, but she said the end product was better and that the buy-in amongst learners who actually were able to contribute meaningfully to that process was huge, and it saved headaches down the road. But we use that word meaningfully because sadly, too often, people are invited to be at the table, but what they share at the table isn't really integrated into end results. So we want to make sure that next step happens, that ideas are integrated. And just looking kind of individually, are people being empowered? Are we displaying, as their kind of providers, kind of an unwaverable belief in their ability, in their character, but yet being realistic and helpful at the same time? Is our praise based on process and effort and what we see learners exhibiting, as they overcome their challenges? All of that, that just goes such a long way. That goes such a long way when everyone is dealing with chronic stress. That goes such a long way when you have undergone trauma and are dealing with the aftermath. Laura in the chat says, great principles to guide inclusive syllabi development and or one's personal diversity statement. Awesome ideas. Great. We actually talked last time about the power of the syllabus And if you can if you can have an inclusive process around creating that, all the better. That syllabus can really be a tool to communicate some of the things that we don't get to communicate every day to students, to communicate things more privately in a way that sticks because they can go back and refer to it. So that syllabus is a place to put resources or suggestions for their health that can complement their learning. Okay, anything else on this idea of kind of big ideas, needs, principles before we move on? And I'm just curious, and I don't mind kind of an awkward pause, but I'm just curious if anybody can think of other examples that you are doing now, either kind of intuitively or under this umbrella of trying to be more trauma informed, things you are doing in your classroom, things you are doing as a system across campus, any other examples related to these 5 big ideas? Well, never fear, because we have lots of examples that we can dive into, and maybe some folks will share later on. As an instructor, and we're going to kind of toggle back and forth between kind of what's most relevant to an instructor, what's most relevant to an administrator. Many of these ideas, of course, are relevant to both. They just play out in a slightly different way. Anything we can do that promote this creation of attachment, relationships, so important. Helping learners deal with their distress, building self-worth, this idea of calm transitions. It's related to that idea of predictability. It's powerful. How we can help to emotionally regulate. There's a level of social and emotional learning here. We can be really intentional about, and there are resources to help with that. We can focus on executive functioning skills. It's hard to be organized when much of your brain power is kind of occupied with this idea of, preventing harm or danger. So kind of helping with tips and tools to stay organized and stay on top of work, but yet being flexible at the same time and encouraging folks to be resourceful. This probably isn't the time to get extra hung up on how academic goals are met. I know there's a level of, these are procedures and these are how we do things in our class, and we want to stick with them and be fair and consistent to all. But kind of consider sometimes if the learning is demonstrated and it comes in a little bit later in a slightly different form, or there was not a printer at home, or XYZ issues arose, really think about, whether or not it behooves everyone to be more stuck on process than outcome. Let's focus on those learning objectives and whether or not they're displayed. That's kind of a soapbox for me, and we're all going to differ on that. We're all going to be on a different part of the spectrum on that, but it's a consideration to keep in mind. I'm noticing in the chat from Michelle, temperature and system checks before students come in. That's such a practical thing to make sure no one's sick, but also it gives people a sense of kind of mental or psychological safety as well, because they know that the people they're interacting with have been checked that day. When doing assessments or intakes, this is from Sarah, my team and I make an effort to explain why we're asking questions and gathering information. Absolutely, include on the why. I've gotten away from I'm losing my chat here with my buttons. So let's make sure I get back to that. Also, we acknowledge that they have control over what they disclose and they don't have to answer if they don't want to. Thanks for this really important point. As we get into strategies, we're going to talk more and more about being open and being someone that students can talk to, and also checking in with students. So that's a balance, right? Of wanting to let students know we care and we're interested, but also not wanting them to feel pressure to disclose. So how we communicate those things is really, really important. So thanks for sharing that. Students have the choice to be hybrid or fully remote in case they're concerned about their safety during this pandemic. Absolutely. Having that option, I think, has been really key. One thing is to acknowledge when students are stepping forward to ask for tutors, class changes, etc. I want them to know how important it is to advocate for themselves. Awesome. This whole idea of we teach the content we teach, but we teach so much more, right? And one of those streams of what we're trying to instill is self-advocacy. And so the fact that you celebrate that goes such a long way. At the beginning of the semester, have students create expectations of me and me of them. I love that, Sandy. So again, that's bringing them in a meaningful way. That's creating buy-in. That's being really honest that you both have responsibility to each other. Love it. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing those ideas. So I'm looking at the time. I think we are going to proceed rather rapidly through a bunch of slides that have way too many words and all look alike and might put us to sleep a little bit. But I included these slides intentionally because when this deck is provided later, I wanted you to have kind of these concise lists at your fingertips as opposed to just pointing you to other resources. So we're going to do that now. If there's anything that rings a bell, chime in at any point. But let's talk about strategies. Let's talk about those practical things we do focused on big ideas. And the first idea really to discuss is the well-being of staff. We know that we need to be well before we can promote wellness in others. So I start there intentionally. We'll talk more about self-care at the end as well, but right now, just this idea of practicing self-compassion, identify your challenges and what you're dealing with, utilizing social supports as you need, make sure that you're having ways to touch base with others to talk about challenges, successes, or even what you're watching on Netflix. Just connecting with other colleagues is vital. When you are trying to build that really needed sense of community. Routine is important. We know this from research that regular sleep, regular and healthy eating, of a regular work schedule as much as we can, physical movement. And I'm really going to throw in there being outside. My disclaimer is that I'm pretty impassioned about the research behind nature and nature deficits and nature therapy and the importance of the outdoor world in our lives. So I'm going to throw that in there as well, just making sure you're doing the things that keep you feeling well and being safe and following the recommendations related to protecting yourself, always to look out for your own well-being. Administrators play an important role in this. Prioritize physical safety of the community by following recommendations, doing all that you need. These things have taken a lot of our time and energy, but they're absolutely necessary to keep folks safe. Checking in with your staff collectively, individually, again, being open without prying, and it's a balance. If they need to take time to take care of themselves, how is that received? Distribute resources who may need additional help, especially when we're talking about kind of secondary stress symptoms or how we absorb the stress of those we're serving, and it wears on us. Look at your PD, look at your professional learning, professional development. Is there some wiggle room in that schedule to incorporate some of these aspects of coping with stress and taking care of yourself as a professional? Validate members' concerns, create opportunities for staff to connect. So it's up to us to do it, but it's up to administrators to make space for that. Then we kind of focus on, once we're well, right? How do we create a learning environment that promotes wellness as well? Some of the same recurring ideas: routine, clear communication. Everybody knows what to expect. You communicate. Sometimes things change on a dime and we don't know they're going to change. But do we communicate as far in advance as possible? Providing information in digestible amounts. I don't know about the rest of you, but I know I'm a bit foggier cognitively than usual right now. Maybe we're all experiencing that to various levels, but let's be intentional about how we provide information. And I feel a little bit hypocritical because I'm pouring a lot on you right now, but let's keep that digestible and consumable. Let students lead the way in sharing what's challenging for them. Let's not make assumptions. How is remote learning going for you? How is everything going for you? Again, I'm open, but I'm not going to press it if you don't feel like sharing. Show appreciation for efforts to complete assignments. Again, assume that it took a lot of effort to do what they needed to do, technology-wise, printing-wise, effort-wise. Everyone in the home at once. You know, things are trickier and tougher these days. Try to work in some kind of relational ritual. You know, sometimes we come in the room or come online in a remote learning environment and we just get down to business, but really people need to check in and acknowledge each other. I'm glad you're here. How's it going? Say hello. Give me a virtual high five. Administrators can help with all this. Encourage teachers and staff as much as possible as they focus on the social and emotional side of learning. And this is huge. This is a whole other webinar series. You know, how can we incorporate social and emotional learning into what we do on the adult level? But support that as you can. Share resources for those who might need it in the community. Be aware of these things. Pandemic plans. People want to know, what is the plan? How are we being taken care of? Include people in the why. Why are we doing the things that we do? Is there space to reflect on what we've learned about students' experiences, especially as we know that the virtual learning situation gives us a different insight into homes. That can be a privacy concern for students. That can be very uncomfortable. There's technology to help with that. We can coach our students in that, but let's be understandable if cameras are off. Let's try to strike balances in this, keeping kind of everyone's dignity and wellness at the forefront at all times. All right, I'm going to pause for comments just really quick. Oh, thanks, Heather, for agreeing on the outside environment. You know, that is for real. It's not just that I'm a tree hugger type. We need nature, we need to be in the wild, and it's good for our brains. And maybe we can do a webinar on that someday. Okay, if everybody's still with me, what about when there are individual concerns? What can we do? And I really preface this with the disclaimer that we're educators, we're not psychologists, we're not mental health providers, we're not counselors, we're not therapists, and nobody is asking you to be one. So in your own systems and with your own team and administrators, have these conversations about where is my role and where does my role end? Because confusion or vagueness over that can be very disconcerting. And we all want to help, but we all want to know the most effective way. But when we do notice that there are concerns, there are going to be ways that we notice as instructors in the classroom where others won't. So that's powerful. So we know when there are changes in behavior, right? And maybe we can provide spaces to be reflective, to kind of let some of those clues that something isn't going well rise to the top in a way that that individual is comfortable with. So sharing their feelings if they feel like it. We notice changes in behavior, and who do we turn to when we notice that, or who do we talk to? These are all system-specific things to have conversations about and to work out. And at least, you know, if you don't feel like the support or the conversation is always there, as an individual, know that you know the number for a hotline or resources in the community so that you can help gear towards help. Okay. So Aubrey in the chat is recommending an expert, the work of Dr. Devon Price, who explicitly writes about academic presumptions of laziness in students and how this is often an unseen barrier. Yes, I appreciate that very, very much, Aubrey. I have not really heard any negative effects of assuming the best of our students. So it's easy to assume laziness. It's easy to assume apathy because we have no idea the obstacles behind them. And we see this, you know, and I'll just chat for a second about the K-12 system. Sometimes those assumptions are applied toward families and parents as well. But I do know that when one individual or one parent's kind of economic hour, their work for an hour in this world yields them minimum wage, and someone else's hour of their life yields hundreds more than that. We're talking about demands on time often that are really challenging and can be assumed from the outside to be lack of care. So that's just one example, right? I'm kind of going on a tangent, but let's assume the best in dealing with our students. Okay, I'm going to scroll a little bit more because I think these comments from you all are really important to share. I hope I'm not missing any. From Catherine, in order to meet the request to have video cameras, my students aim the camera so it only hits the top of their head. That's a compromise. That's a great compromise. You see them, you know they're there, they're responding. They don't have to worry about background or their personal appearance to learn that day. Let's see what else. I apologize for the delays. I've got sensitive buttons over here. It's hard to build relationships in the online classroom, no kidding, but it's possible. I was guilty of being frustrated. I'm sorry, guys, I'm dealing with weird tech things over here. By students' cameras being off, it can be frustrating, I understand. And when I encouraged them to turn on, I realized how many of them had children they were caring for at the same time. They were doing the best they could to be present. It was a good reminder of what people are juggling right now. Oh my gosh, isn't it true? There are little people afoot everywhere in environments that they usually aren't welcome. This is a society thing. It's not something I enjoy, but as a society, we've kind of come to these norms along the way that children aren't in classrooms, children are in workplaces, children aren't in offices, and we can have a big conversation about that. But now all of a sudden those lines are blurred and people are layering responsibilities, doing multiple things at once. We know that multitasking is a myth. It's never, you can never do it well. So people are juggling at all times. So again, let's assume the best. Thank you so much for that. And just a thank you from your colleague for the reminder about the cameras. Okay, super helpful. Thanks for everybody for sharing as we go. If the pace of things is not good, let me know because I'm just kind of flying. But again, these slides will be available later as well. Okay, moving on. What can administrators to do on this level of individual concerns? There's outreach you can do with community partners around mental health and bring them into the fold in your learning institutions so that people know the resources and know how to get help. When you communicate with learners, normalize stress, mention ways that mental health professionals can help. This idea of normalizing can go with the instructors as well. It's powerful. We know that when we don't feel alone in what we're experiencing for some reason, somehow, because we're highly social creatures, that makes us often feel better. So normalizing without diminishing. There's a big difference between get over it, everybody's going through this right now, which is diminishing, and normalizing, which is, I really hear you how hard this is. I'm experiencing it too. Your classmates are experiencing it. We're all in together. So let's normalize without diminishing. Ensure that all staff have been trained to identify some of these indicators of trauma and mental health. This is hard, you guys. You're not experts. You don't need to be an expert. But we're also highly intuitive creatures. If something is giving you a red flag, I would not discount it. You are a protective factor for everyone sitting in your classroom or online with you on the computer. So don't be afraid to use that power in the channels that your system provides for providing help. Okay. Administrators from the chat can also be on the front lines of identifying and reducing burdensome paperwork on students and staff and faculty. Simplify work and workflows as much as possible to take less of that time and energy. Okay, so there are these related ways that we can just kind of lighten loads right now. And I do feel the need to say, this is not a to-do list. This is not, please get off the webinar and do everything in your classroom. Please get off the webinar and tell your administrator that she or he needs to do this, this, and this. We have to be understanding of each other that there's only so much we can bite off at one time, but this is a brainstorm. These are ideas, and absolutely that idea of just how can we lighten your load in other areas is a great one. addressing those individual concerns. And again, this is kind of a short list because, you know, hopefully we direct people to professionals that can help them more. But individual conferences are always helpful to check in with students and just create a space where they can share their concerns without prying or making anyone uncomfortable. Talk with your schools, your institutions, mental health professional to better understand how to connect students when necessary. So again, knowing where your role passes on to someone else. Administrators, work with your mental health staff to develop a list of resources. Consider, again, the professional development space and how you can use that to be supportive. Develop partnerships with agencies for those professional learning reasons or for referral reasons. And, you know, hallway check-ins happen when we're in person together in kind of informal ways. Think about how you can replicate that virtually. How can you set up times with people to just check in and hear their concerns? In creating education, awareness always as a goal, educators can encourage students to connect privately if they have concerns. Greet your students by name and create a routine to greet the group. We talked about that. Talk about other times of crisis and focus on resilience, and don't just downplay how hard it was, but focus on how communities recovered and rebounded. Encourage, again, fresh air, movement, these things that keep us healthy. Share stories of hope and helping. It sounds fluffy or soft, but it's neurologically powerful when we share positive stories. We started off the session sharing some ideas around gratitude. What are you grateful for today? That might sound cheesy to some, but there is powerful research on the neurological benefits of focusing on gratitude, that there are biochemical changes in our makeup that occur when we focus on the things that make us feel hopeful or grateful. So absolutely, let's try to incorporate these things. Affirm students. That can go a long way right now in an authentic way, in a way that's about them and not us. You know, it's not really, I like your paper. It's, I can see the effort you put into your paper. I really see your talent shine through. I really see your unique perspective on this. You know, our praise is about them and it's about process. Let students know people find help in different ways. They don't have to fall into a cookie cutter. Engage students in creating these rituals and celebrations for achieving goals. Gosh, we need those little touch points where we feel like we're making progress. So don't be afraid to do that. We're low on time, so I'm going to go really fast. Administrators can help do all of this well. Again, it's about partnerships. It's about being in touch with your staff. It's about providing space for people to talk about these things. We don't have adequate time to go into this, so this will be a teaser for one of our later sessions, but we all work in diverse situations with richness in culture, in heritage, in what makes our families unique, what makes us demographically unique, how our race can be strengthening and supportive and everything good. We need to recognize that. So cultural responsiveness on the part of instructors, learn what your students find stressful and helpful. Don't assume. Believe students' stories, especially around inequity. Systems are inequitable, so we can't just discount that. We don't minimize those experiences. Seek out resilient behavior and reframe cultural responses to stress. Again, it's about avoiding our own centric views, our own assumptions, and listening, you know, to what is helpful or not for people. This is very vague, but we'll get into it more later. Administrators can do the same, provide support and guidance for their staff to help them do it. Avoid dissuading staff from receiving consultation related to social identity because it might make people uncomfortable. We need to learn how to have these conversations. How do we make our classrooms welcoming, our systems welcoming to all people without bias? We'll talk more about that in a later webinar. How do we actively seek to address inequities? Again, resist the desire to treat everyone the same because their experiences are not the same. And a cookie cutter approach can do harm to our most vulnerable students. At the same time, we're asking you to do so much. Let's keep our expectations realistic. Let's be a bit gentle on ourselves. I just had an email exchange with a community college administrator, and I grabbed her words and told her I would. COVID's changed everything. We had the plan of what we were going to do in regard to trauma awareness, and now we have the reality of what we're able to do. We're not necessarily calling everything trauma aware. We're just trying to implement these good practices because we feel it's the right thing to do for what the needs we're seeing. Again, let's not get hung up. Is this trauma? Is this stress? Is this social emotional? Is this poverty? It's everything. So let's just put the practices in place that help people without getting too tied up on the labels. We've been in this for a year now, she says. How do we keep working through these emotions? Our kids are over it. They are over the semester and we're only 4 weeks in. So what are we doing as a staff to support each other? I share this because you're not alone. We're all feeling this way. For those of you who have to hop off, no problem. We've got maybe 2 minutes left for those of you who can stay. I'm sorry to not be more timely, but be gentle on yourself. We can't do everything at once. Maybe there's a small bit of implementable practice that we can bite off one small bit at a time to try to make routine. If you get overwhelmed by that list of strategies, remember the big ideas. Care, be aware of where people can get more help, be flexible. Are they demonstrating their learning? Point to resources. We will continue to talk about secondary traumatic stress. It's a huge topic, unworthy of rushing through. It has many dimensions. We talked about quite a few of them throughout the session, but specifically during a pandemic, stay connected, even if we have to be more effortful about it because we're not doing it in the natural ways. Remember the basics: health, sleep, outside, food. I love this idea. Create a coping toolkit. When things are too much, what are those activities you can do that make you feel calm and joyful and keep them close by? Be intentional about your exposure to media. What is your personal balance of needing to know what's going on and knowing too much to the point where it's anxiety producing? So that's a different balance for each of us, but be mindful of it. Don't be afraid to ask for mental health services if needed, even if you're a totally competent, wise, experienced professional. Of course, we all can use professional help to stay mentally healthy, so don't let that be a barrier. And again, normalize your struggles. We're all in this together. Understand that and be kind. Because really, it's about that. It's about kindness. It's about dignity, connection, resilience. This lady is my mom. I took her for her first vaccine the other day, and I had to capture. She was so grateful and hopeful that there's a light at the end of this tunnel. I just had to capture her image. We are all resilient beings, so let's help each other to be so. If anything you heard today or anything happening in your life requires you to maybe reach out and get a little bit more help, this is one hotline that I think is helpful. They can point you in the right direction as far as resources, even on the local level, which is why I like to share this SAMHSA hotline, 662-HELP. Feel free to be in touch with me with questions, concerns, ideas about what you'd like to see in the rest of our webinar series. And for now, thanks so much for giving me 3 extra minutes plus an hour. I know that's invaluable. Thank you also for the work you do. We're all in this together. We're all hoping to serve students. Walk away from this webinar not feeling down about all the things you could be doing. Please pat yourself on the back for taking the time to learn more. And again, as I said, we can make efforts one bite size at a time. That's all I've got, Amy and Brittany. If there are any questions, comments, thoughts, I am very happy to stick around.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Shanna. This was some great information. I did want to note that I put a link in the chat that will take you to the webpage where all of the webinar recordings and resources will be posted. You can also find the registration links to the upcoming webinars within this series on that page as well. We do ask that you give us a little bit of grace to give us a day or two to get everything uploaded on there, but that is in the chat if you want to continue on this journey cohort with us within the next couple of weeks as well. So Shanna, thank you so much. Thank you all for participating, and have a wonderful rest of your week and a happy weekend.